So thanks for coming. My talk starts where Colin Crouch finishes his talk 2 weeks ago. It starts with the contention, yes, we have seen that the economic crisis has been triggered by wrong economic policies 4 weeks ago. Then Colin Crouch has restated 2 weeks ago that there is a need to balance market-making mechanisms in the European integration process with social policies that counteract or correct market forces. But then at the end of his talk, he concluded that it's not enough to think of this issue as a kind of a functional balance. As sometimes industrial relations scholars do, we see systems as a kind of a functional equilibrium between different parties. But social change depends on social actors, depends very much on people that are fighting for social change. Colin Crouch mentioned Karl Polanyi in his presentation and mentioned and took a lot from his insight in terms of the impossibility of a disembedded market. But we can also read Karl Polanyi in a different way, that the process of re-embedding market forces depends very much on social movements, on counter forces, on collective action. So the question I would like to answer today in my talk on European economic governance and transnational collective action is actually precisely the question, why has there not been more transnational collective action in response, not to the crisis, but in response to the dramatic shift in economic governance that we have seen in the last years. I will proceed in 3 ways. First, I will talk about the new economic governance regime, explain what has happened. Here in Ireland, we know very much what had happened to some extent because we were a victim of, or a kind of a subject of the Troika conditionality in relation to the bailout program that we have seen here. And everybody here knows what that means. But what is less known is that economic governance has also been changed fundamentally on the European Union level. For all EU countries, a new regime has been introduced, a new system of economic governance with the six-pack on economic governance in 2011 as the first step. And then following that, other laws have been adopted. So the question today is not about Ireland's reaction or about Greece's reaction. It is a talk very much based on the European Union level, on the European level. Why has there not been more collective action at European Union level against these fundamental changes that we have seen? And this question is also challenging for myself, because in the European Union's book that I published in 2008, in which I studied the potential contribution of the trade union movement to make the European Union more democratic, looking at the case studies that I looked at the time, company mergers, collective bargaining coordination, some successful action of trade unions against the then Bolkestein directive, which was altered as a result of transnational trade union action. The conclusion of that book was, the more the transnational Europeanization process gets political, the easier it will be to politicize it, to use this as crystallization points for transnational collective action. So that is challenging for me now, because now we have seen a centralization of political power in the new economic governance regime. We have seen a shift in economic governance from kind of an assumption that the market will actually rule European integration process, and there will be an automatic adaptation of market forces that will bring about change to a much more interventionistic, much more political regime where European Commission, European Central Bank adopts political decisions and actually condones political interventions in countries. I remember 2.5 years ago, I had the privilege to be in Dublin Castle, invited at a talk with the Troika, with fellow academics and the social partners. And one of my colleagues challenged the Troika and challenged in particular the DG Economics and Finance spokesperson that was there for the European Commission, saying, your model, and Aidan was there as well, so your model is wrong. You think of a system of automatic adaptations in a neoliberal, neoclassical sense, and we have seen that this neoliberal model doesn't work. What was revealing, and I'm sorry I haven't taped it, I should have taped it, the response was very interesting because the Commission spokesperson said, yeah, we agree. You don't have to tell us about institutional economics. We learned the lesson. That's why we are here. If the market would do the job, we wouldn't be here. So we are here now to do the job that the market doesn't do, and we do it by political intervention. So that is the overview over the talk, and I will start with the first point, namely the creation of the new European economic governance regime. This really requires an explanation, because until 2007, and we did incidentally with colleagues on the European Foundation, we did a research project. We interviewed 100 business leaders, industrial relations practitioners from employer side, trade union side, and also representatives of national governments and European Commission in 2007. And almost everybody, with the exception of the unions, rejected the idea that there should be governance of any kind at the European Union level in terms of industrial relations or wage bargaining. That was seen as something that should be left to the national level. And only a few years later, we are now witnessing these direct interventions into the field of industrial relations under the new six-pack on economic governance. The shift, or the silent revolution, to take the term from Commissioner or Commission President Barroso, that led to the six-pack on economic governance in 2011, then following that the fiscal treaty and the two-pack on economic governance, was actually quite a radical shift in the thinking of European business leaders, I think, and European political leaders. At long last, Jacques Delors would have said, or have said actually, it was seen that market forces don't create convergence. Of course, different people had different convergence in mind. Maybe employers had more downward convergence in mind in wages and working conditions, and unions or social democratic politicians like Delors more an upward convergence. But the idea was that convergence would be the outcome of the common market, of the monetary union, of the single integration process. But as we know, the outcome was not convergence, but macroeconomic imbalances, big tensions inside the European economic integration process. And this led to this new regulation on the 24th of November 2011. It's about 70 pages of regulations, and I don't have the time to talk through all them now in the next 5-6 minutes. So I will concentrate myself only on Regulation 4 and 5 on the prevention and correction of macroeconomic imbalances and on the enforcement measures to correct excessive macroeconomic imbalances in the Eurozone. Because these, I think, are, if you read them carefully, you understand that the whole economic policy regime has changed in the European Union as a result of these changes, as a result of a shift, of a silent revolution in the heads also of our European elites. So, as lawyers normally would do, of course, there has to be a legal foundation in the treaties for any law in the European Union. And there is one, actually, in Article 121.6, in a little sentence, there is a reference in the Treaty for the Functioning of the European Union that fiscal and macroeconomic policies shall be subject to multinational surveillance procedures. And these surveillance procedures, or these governance regime, has to be put in law, in regulation, not in directives, so the regulations that are directly applicable. And these regulations have to be adopted by not just the Council, but also by the European Parliament. And that has happened in this case. So the parliamentarians voted in favor of that as well. Some of the major points that relate to the other regulations, of course, is a reinforcement of the Stability and Growth Pact, which existed before, insofar as not only the 3% deficit procedure for new annual deficit is now a kind of a constraining target, but now also the overall debt target of 60% has been put into legislation as an objective. And then a corresponding reinforcement of the European surveillance procedures to force countries to reduce budget deficits along that line. What is also new, of course, is a new procedure, the so-called excessive imbalance procedure. A procedure that allows European policymakers, the Commission makes a proposal and then endorsed by the Council to give concrete instructions to member states what to do to avoid macroeconomic imbalances. We will see what that means in a minute. What is also new is that these new policy proposals are, not just statements, but they are supported by enforcement mechanisms that are quite constraining, namely financial fines, and quite high financial fines. So in the order of 0.2% GDP per annum in case of violations of the deficit procedures, and 0.1% per annum for a member state that doesn't comply with the instructions issued by the Commission in relation to the excessive imbalance procedure. In Ireland, that would only be 750 million euro fine per year, so quite a substantial number. What is also new in this regulation is that, you can say, in the past we have had in the past regulations about deficit procedures, but they haven't been implemented because the Council blocked it. And it was very difficult to get them at the required majority in the Council to actually fine somebody. And in order to address this problem, policymakers have invented a new fining procedure, which is based on the so-called reversed qualified majority voting in the European, in the Council, which means that if the Commission makes a proposition to fine a member state for non-compliance, the member state has 10 days to organize a qualified majority in order to veto the imposition of the fines. And that actually means that it's reversed qualified majority voting, because before the Commission needed the qualified majority of member states to impose something or to do something. Now the member states needs a 2/3 majority to prevent the Commission from fining the member state. And of course the member state has no right to vote if it is about sanction concerning the member state in question, which is also a change. So quite some, I would say, radical changes, and you understand why Barroso in a talk in my alma mater used the term silent revolution, not in the written manuscript that's published on the website, but unfortunately there was a journalist, ANSA journalist in the room that tweeted or kind of wrote a press communique after that presentation. So it's quite a fundamental change. And it's quite a fundamental change also in the so-called successful Irish case, because indeed, yes, our deficit is going down and we are very good for instance, in getting our deficit back from the high levels that we have had. But if 60% is the target that gives Commission right to give us instruction, we are far away from reaching that. And even countries like Germany, actually, or France, are also above the 60% ceiling. So in that sense, it is quite a constraining structure, the new governance procedure. And it's even more constraining if you look at the definition of words. Because I'm not a legal scholar, but normally there is a legal principle that you shall not be fined for something which is not stated in the law as a crime. So we have to know the crime before we can be fined. So let's look at the definitions of the crime. What are the definitions of the crime of an imbalanced macroeconomic position? If you read the directive, we see the following definition. Imbalances mean any trend giving rise to macroeconomic developments which are adversely affecting or have the potential to adversely affect the proper functioning of the economy of a member state or of economic and monetary union or of the union as a whole. Okay, it's quite large, the definition, but it's only about imbalances, and there is no fine for being in an imbalance. There's only a fine for an excessive imbalance. But if you read the next paragraph, only one word changes, namely the term excessive and severe, and all the rest remains the same. So you tend to be fined, or you can be fined if you're producing excessive imbalances that create severe imbalances that give rise to economic developments which are adversely affecting or have, again, the potential of adversely to affect a member state, the EMU, or the union as a whole. So the potential is still in the definition. And I think doesn't mean that now everything there will be fines, and actually so far there was no fine whatsoever. But it really, if I read this directive, I think it has been written in a way to give the executive the power to define what is proper and improper policy in the economic field, and what is and there doesn't seem to be a priori a field that is outside of the scope of the application of the directive. So we see a centralization of governance that goes, in my view, even further than the power of federal governments in federal systems like Switzerland, like United States, or like Germany. Because in the Swiss Bundesrat, or the German government, doesn't have the power to intervene and give concrete interventions in such a far-ranging sphere into policy making. How this is implemented, because we have seen in the directive that is only written about good or bad or proper economic policies. So what that means actually is that the definition of what is proper and improper is also delegated to the executives. And what the Commission has done together with the Council and the European committees, the joint committees that the two organizations operate, is first establish a scoreboard of quantitative indicators. We have found 11 indicators that help us to tell us what is good economic policy. And then all countries will be studied according to these 11 indicators. And if some red flags go up, then an in-depth review will be conducted. And as a result of that, country-specific recommendations will be issued for member states. If member states do that and implement that, then that's fine. If not, the Commission, the Council have the right to propose corrective action plans, and if they don't work, issue fines. And if you look at the 11 indicators, you can't see them. Just to give you, you don't have to read, they are online, the so-called MIP scoreboards. You will see that, for instance, nominal unit labor costs, which is an indicator to measure wage developments, is part of it. And then we have thresholds over 3 years change, which are acceptable. So 9% increase in Eurozone countries over 3 years is acceptable. But in non-Eurozone countries, we can accept 12% increase. It's not clear why Eurozone countries should be have more wage moderation than others, but that's the decision. But what is more important is not we can't discuss the factors. What we see more here is almost all countries are in the red somewhere. I think there is no country, if you go through from A to Z here, from Belgium to the UK, there is no country that doesn't create problems. Because in one of the indicators, one country is certainly a problem. And then what is then even more interesting is the country-specific recommendations. For instance, now I have chosen the social field that come out of this. There are clear indications that proper economic policies mean neoliberal economic policies in terms of questioning wage indexation rules, or what is behind the language, the Eurozone language there. Reviewing wage setting systems aligned with productivity development means decentralization of economic wage bargaining policies, reducing multi-employer bargaining systems, going to company-based bargaining systems, make it more difficult to extend wage bargaining for an entire sector, etc., etc. So again, quite substantial changes, and people don't know too much about that. But again, the question is, some people should know about it, namely, we pay some trade union lobbyists in Brussels. There is the European Trade Union Confederation. There are also left-wing parliamentarians. There are critical people in Brussels. Why wasn't there a transnational political mobilization against these regimes, as there has actually been against the Bolkestein Directive, for instance, in the past? Why hasn't this triggered a mobilization against this in this framework? And that is even more important as I've argued before, the more we politicize, the more kind of guidelines become political, the easier actually should be to counteract or to mobilize people against that. So what I want to do is I would like to explain why has it been so difficult for unions to mobilize against this new regime or to ask for a different regime. And I'm doing that by looking at the policy formation and implementation process in relation to this whole sphere of economic governance. And I'm doing that looking at the three phases. First, the agenda setting sphere, the agenda setting kind of phase. The second, the policy adaptation phase. And the third, the policy implementation phase. As mentioned already at the beginning of my talk, Keynesian economists were very happy when people that normally would be only in favor of markets eventually agreed there needs to be economic governance. At long last, Jacques Delors argued in an article written together with a social policy colleague and a CFDT trade unionist, at long last, the neoliberals have understood that it's not possible to have a European economic monetary system without a political union. At long last, it is common sense that we have to have a political framework to govern the monetary union. And in fact, if you go back in history, the term economic governance or economic government was always a kind of a Keynesian proposition. It was supported by the trade unions, as I mentioned before, from already in the late 1990s, European Trade Union Confederation proposed that there should be some coordination in terms of wage bargaining, but involving the unions in order to prevent imbalances and beggar thy neighbor policies of one national system against another national system, to have a more coordinated framework. And that, I think, that first positive reaction was, I think, explains why there was no outcry at the very beginning. The European Trade Union Confederation discussed this proposition, and in fairness, inside ETUC, people were a bit more skeptical than Jacques Delors, and saw the danger that this could be used in a way that would be actually imposing cutbacks or attacks on national wage bargaining system. And as a response, the ETUC did actually lobby the European Parliament to change some of the original directive's proposals. So as a result of the ETUC lobbying, a new article or a new sub-article was actually introduced into the six-pack, or in the different regulations of the six-pack. The application of this regulation shall fully observe Article 152, Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, and the recommendations issued under this regulation shall respect national practices and institutions for wage bargaining. This regulation takes into account Article 128 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, and accordingly does not affect the right to negotiate, conclude, or enforce collective agreements, or to take collective action in accordance with national law and practices. That was an important amendment, and the ETUC succeeded, and the European Parliament imposed that amendment. The problem, however, is that the Commission had also a response, and a creative response. And the creative response based not only on German labor market deregulations of 2005, which didn't challenge the constitutional principle of bargaining autonomy, but also the Irish public sector wage cuts of 2009, which are also referenced as an example in a policy paper in 2010, in which the Commission says, in most member states, wages are formed in a collective bargaining process without formal involvement of governments. Nevertheless, policymakers can affect wage-setting mechanisms, wage-setting processes via a number of ways, including the provision of information or wage rules, changes to wage indexation rules, and the signaling role of public sector wages. In addition, reform of labor markets should also contribute to make wage-setting processes more efficient. So thus, yeah, of course, if the government cuts wages, as in Ireland, by 20%, it is not a violation of collective bargaining autonomy, because the government acts not as government, but as employer, and employers can negotiate what they want. And then, of course, wage bargaining is sensible to changes in social protection. If, as in Germany, unemployment benefits are cut back to such a level that unemployed people have to work for €1 an hour as part of their €1 job agreement, then that has an effect on wage setting in the entire economy without actually affecting things. So however, that counter argument was lost a bit in the discussion. The creative interpretation of the law by European policymakers is actually very difficult to counter, because as a collective action you need kind of political leaders that stick to rules and not to find way to creatively reinterpret the rules. But this creative reinterpretation is, I think, another most prominent issue that has emerged now in the policy adaptation stages, especially in 2011, 2012, which was very important because that was the center of the acute euro crisis, where the Greek case and our case and other cases were at the center, and people were really worried that the whole euro would collapse. So there was, I think, we can explain the acceptance of taking a bit a loose approach to the rule of law by these exceptional circumstances which demand, quote, everything what it takes to bring about a solution. And I'm quoting Ulrich Beck here. Ulrich Beck wrote at the time an interesting book about German Europe, in which he actually criticizes the idea of German hegemony. But he also makes use of Carl Schmitt, the infamous German legal scholar, we could maybe put it that way, which also at the time justified a political system which was based on we have to do everything what it takes to achieve our objectives. And Beck would argue that, of course, we don't use it today in terms like Schmitt has argued in order to justify kind of a Nazi system, but on the contrary, we use it to justify the positive achievements of European integration and of people coming together. But nevertheless, we have to do everything what it takes. And in that pressure year of 2011, 2012, that might explain also why people even told when I did interviews, yes, of course, we knew we couldn't this is a bad system, it doesn't work. But we had to do something to calm the markets, or we had to do something to secure Ireland being still part of the ESM, as it was a big argument in the discussion about the fiscal treaty in Ireland at the time. So we had situations where the Irish Congress of Trade Unions would say this is all wrong, but nevertheless we are not mobilizing against it because we don't see an alternative at that stage. But then I think the most important change, the most important explanation why it is difficult to politicize this new governance regime became evident in the policy implementation phase. And that is still ongoing, and it explains why we are not kind of not in the acute phase of the crisis anymore, but why there is still not enough discussion about this economic policy regime. And the reason for that is that European policymakers learned something from business schools, actually. So they shifted the governance model. They threw out all the political science textbooks about governance model and looked at governance models in multinational corporations. They looked, and I would argue it's not, we do not have an intergovernmental system or a federal system or whatever system. We have now a governance system which is modeled on corporate governance, which is based on a central headquarter, which, however, doesn't govern by law or by clear division of power between the subsidiaries and the headquarters, but uses key performance indicators to govern its subsidiaries. And these key performance indicators are based, in the European Union case, on these national data sets. So we go back to our logo, and we could look at the same data sets with other key performance indicators in multinational corporations, where we also have a kind of a controlling of activities of different subsidiaries in relation to these key performance indicators. But this system is very difficult to politicize, because what do you do when you are in a meeting? And I presented, for instance, in other circumstances, league tables. You know, what do we do if I'm a Dutch person? I just look, okay, yeah, we're not too good. We have five red flags. But in Belgium we only have 3, so it won't be as difficult as it sounds, and this system will be more a problem for the other countries, not for myself. So it creates a situation, so this type of government creates a situation which kind of nationalizes policy implementation and kind of breaks it down and helps undermining joint mobilizations. So I'm sure if there would have been a European regulation for the abolition of extension mechanisms in collective bargaining, that European regulation would never have passed the European Parliament. If there would have been a European regulation to increase the retirement age by 5 years, or 2 years even, it would have created an incentive for people to see this is something we don't want, or we want. At least we would have had a political debate, and we would have a debate about this concrete proposition. But in this system, we have centralized the economic governance regime. We have a centralized supranational regime, which, however, doesn't shield itself from political contestation through a technocratic discourse, as in the past. It's still very technocratic, of course, but I think there is an understanding that European policymakers and business leaders see that we can't avoid a politicization in some extent of these issues, because they become, we don't have growth for everybody as we have had in the first 40, 50 years of the European integration process, where we had a kind of, we could legitimate our system through output legitimacy, as Fritz Scharf would have said. But we have now a situation where that is not possible. So what we do instead is we legitimize European, legitimize European system by introducing a political system, but a political system that nationalizes social conflict using these benchmarking mechanisms and these key performance indicators. In industrial relations, we have studied, of course, multinationals, and we have seen that even key performance indicators is not a guarantee for governments or for multinational corporations to get what they want. The putting into competition of different subsidiaries against each other is, on the one side, challenging collective action across borders, but it's also motivating it. It's the same with trade unions. You know, trade unions wouldn't exist if there wouldn't be any competition between workers. So only the competition between workers makes it possible to have trade unions to counteract that. So in that sense, this system is not without alternative. It is possible that unions or workers or collective action will happen when people start to understand what game is played, or what kind of system in which are we living in. But still, there are many open questions, because I think I finish here now not with a conclusion, but I really finish with open questions, because we are entering into a new phase. And this new phase will also challenge the way we do science. We do social science, we do comparative social science. Some people have argued, yes, you overstate this, Roland, you are too dramatic. The Commission now has a new leadership, and some colleagues have analyzed the country-specific recommendations. And in fact, if you analyze the country-specific recommendations, there is an increase in the last year of so-called social policy recommendations. So there is a kind of an adjustment. But then the question is, what is a social policy recommendation? The research based on the first contention is just looking at everything that has to do with social, but you can have progressive social changes and you can have regressive social changes, and you would have to be a bit deeper and to understand what are the social propositions now progressive or regressive. What is also interesting is, I think this new phase challenges also some left-wing understanding of European integration, or even Fritz it also challenges those that have seen neoliberalism as something that is enshrined in the constitutional principles of the treaties. Gill, for instance, already in '99 said this is a constitutional straitjacket. No, it is not. Now, we could, if we would have a socialist European Commission, which is a big if, of course, but legally speaking, if it is legal to have maximum benchmarks for wage developments, it must also be legal to have minimum benchmarks for wage developments. So the Commission, the actual law only says you should pursue proper economic policies. It doesn't identify what proper economic policies is. So what I mentioned before, the new system is much more an executive-based system, not a law-based system. And the executive has a lot of power to determine what good economic policy is. So those that say we can't do anything because every change needs a change of the constitution or the treaties, which can be vetoed by one member state. As you've seen in the last years, that hasn't been a limit for introducing radical change without treaty change even. So I think the big issue there is not constitutionality of the EU system, it is political will, of course. But then, last but not least, a challenge for us social scientists. And we are somehow also maybe responsible for this, because many industrial relations scholars or even international political economists, we still think in country boxes. We come from a mindset which I would call, which is based on methodological nationalism. What does that mean? Methodological nationalism means that we can understand the European system by looking at the national boxes and then putting the national boxes together to a whole system. As individual methodological individualism means we understand the society by looking at the individuals only and interview the individuals. But maybe the economic imbalances that we have seen, or the big economic transformation that we've seen, they are not following national boxes. And therefore we have to think, is it possible to have another understanding, or how could it be to have another understanding that doesn't follow and doesn't reproduce these national boxes, which then are used for our key performance indicators. And I know there is some work done in this field along transnational supply chains, for instance, by colleagues in the business school and elsewhere. And even European Central Bank started to think that actually GDP figures are not telling us what's actually happening. So there is some thinking to think in different ways about how we represent the economy. And that is not just a methodological issue, of course, but it's also important in terms of going beyond the methodological nationalism that is behind the economic governance procedure that we have now in Europe, in the European Union. Thanks very much for coming. Okay, so I didn't talk too much about unions today, that's true. But we have written about unions in another context. So there is a special issue of the European Trade Union Institute Transfer, where we actually looked at transnational collective action of unions. So there was a transnational day of strike action even, the first in history in 2012, across countries involving unions, mostly in Portugal and Spain, but also Greece and Italy, and also in Belgium. So there is an understanding that to be limited in the national context is a problem. And as a result of that action, the next day Barroso wanted to be invited to the next meeting of the executive of the European Trade Union Confederation, and they started to be more social in their country-specific recommendation, at least nominally. So there is no foregone conclusion. But it's true. Maybe it's not just the unions, as I mentioned, also Jacques Delors himself, or José Bové, a Green parliamentarian. So it seems that economic governance has taken the concept from the Euro-Keynesian left-wing critical people that said we can't govern the monetary union without common structures. But then the implementation, the policy prescriptions that are then used in the country-specific recommendations are still neoliberal. So we have, so the argument that we had before is, that's why maybe a response also to your question. Before new economic governance, we could say we can't have European coordination of wage policies in order to fight kind of a race to the bottom, or in order to avoid beggar thy neighbor strategies, because there is no structural, political, institutional setting at the European Union level that would allow us to do so. Now we have an economic governance regime that gives a lot of power to the European Union level. So you can't use that argument anymore as an argument to do nothing. And you can now say, you should say to Mr. Juncker or other European representatives, now we even have had direct elections, indirect direct elections of the European Commission, so to speak. You should respond to political concerns or social concerns of the people to address that. So unions were not totally naive. I think among those that were looking at the pictures, they were the least naive, but they were still overrun by then developments on the grounds. And the crisis was so harsh sometimes that, for instance, the Irish case, union said, all right, we are not allowed to have more than 8% wage increases over 3 years. If that is constraining, we would love to have that, wouldn't we? You know, we have had wage cuts in Ireland, so we didn't really, it didn't look very, very constraining in that context. So that explains maybe also the reaction. So that everybody was kind of fighting in their national corners the emergencies that appeared in one or the other case. There were some cases of transnational action. But it's also true that this nationalism, and especially the playing off of the Northerners against Southerners or Easterners against Westerners, was also used as a mechanism to undermine collective action. When I did interviews with the Commission, not just in Dublin, but also, though this is research based on interviews with labor unions and Commission representatives, also employer organizations. It's actually published in the recent history of labor history, so you can actually read the paper if you're interested. When I talked to them, they didn't mention corporate governance as a model. No. But there is, of course, a literature about governance by numbers, but the connection to corporate governance just sprung into my mind because I'm based in the business school and I'm teaching this. I'm doing human resource management classes, and then originally I'm a political scientist, and then I saw all the stuff about institutions and different European regimes that European Union scholars debate. Intergovernmentalism, federalism, blah, blah, etc. Can't capture this development, and I just looked at my HRM slides, so to speak, or my work in the corporate world, so to speak, to see that here is a parallel, and maybe this new system is actually informed more by corporate governance than by any of the legal concepts of political authority that we have had before. So in some sense, some people argued the EU is about the democratic deficit, but in my view, this system is also going behind or beyond, whatever, how you call it, the rule of law. It is a system based on ad hoc decisions. Arguably it's based on rules. This is rule-based governance, but if you then look what is behind the rules, who defines the rules, you find out it is a very much executive-based ad hoc system as applied in multinational corporations. I think there is a distinction when we discuss the law about law as a technique. And if you look at it just in terms, is it a legal document? Is it law? Of course it is law. It is 5 regulations and 1 directive, as you said. But my question is it law in the sense of the rule of law? And there I have my doubts, because there is a fundamental principle, for instance, and that relates to the second point, about sanctions. In the rule of, one critical principle in the rule of law is that you know for what you get sanctioned and for what you don't get sanctioned. Here we have a situation, and that's true, for what we don't know whether if the government France, if the concrete case, European Commission writes country-specific recommendation to France. And it says, you have to do this and that, and your labor law is too rigid, and you have to change that, and you have to change that, you have to change that. Then the French government doesn't know what it has to do not to be punished. It is not clear where the boundary is. Normally they do something, and then the response is very much well done, but it's not sufficient, the report, and we have to do more. And that is the situation in which we are. And that is a situation where principles of law are, I think, undermined. Because one principle of law is you know for what you get sanctioned. But here we don't know for what you get sanctioned. And it is up to the executive to use, and the Commission admitted, your Commission officials admitted there is political consideration when it enforces rules or when not. And when there is, it thinks is leeway or where it is not. But that's not the rule of law. When an executive can decide when a law applies and when not. I think, you know, the most important point is, I agree with you, is the shadow of the law. And when you look at the shadow of the law, and I have some examples in the paper, France is a good example, I think. When a socialist French government implements labor law changes that go in the neoliberal direction, and is so convinced that it actually uses a mechanism that was actually foreseen for emergency situations to bypass the parliament, because it realized that if it doesn't do it, then the parliament will vote against the proposition that the government wants to do in response to the country-specific recommendation. When a prime minister and a French president is prepared to trigger the emergency procedures in the French constitutional system to bypass the law, because it knows that it will be voted down by its own parliamentary group in parliament, and it does that 10 days before the Commission will issue its recommendation on sanctions, which of course it hasn't done because the government has done the changes, at least going in the right direction, as the Commission says, but of course not sufficient, etc. So they have to come back again in 2 years, etc. Then I think we have seen a radical change.